So these elements, who here has seen this document from the National Center on Intensive Intervention in CII? Have you seen this considerations for effective implementation? Cheryl, seen it? Okay, Annette has. All right, so a lot of people haven't, so I'm glad to share it with you. And if you've heard me do this little speech before, I apologize. But my dissertation focused at least quite a bit on fidelity. I was looking at sustainability, but I chose PBIS schools who had demonstrated fidelity for a certain number of years. So had a big section on fidelity. And one of my favorite articles was from Dane and Schneider, would have been 1998. And this infographic is based on that article. I think there's probably some other things thrown in, but the basic idea is there. And what they said was there are 5 elements of fidelity. So we've got adherence, which we're all pretty well aware of, exposure and duration, which I think we're aware of, but don't always measure, quality of delivery, program specificity, and I've had interesting conversations with Amy Gomer Erickson, who's here with us, and Patty Noonan about, you know, like the HQPD, the high quality professional development checklist, observation checklist. That gets at overall how you do your training, but there's also that element of, are you training them in the specific instructional practices and content for the program you're focused on, right? How do you get at that? And then this is the other side of it. How are people doing it with fidelity? I guess if you talk about in the classroom. And then student engagement, are the students actually receiving it, right? Because you, like, even me now in this group, I could be saying all of this, and if you all are doing something else in the background, it really doesn't matter. I've said it. Same thing with educators. If the students aren't engaged, doesn't really matter. So which is the easiest element of fidelity for your project, and which is the hardest? And I'm going to ask folks to go ahead and use their mic or use the chat, whatever is most comfortable for you. So which is the easiest and which is the hardest for your project? And yes, I can definitely share that link with you in a moment. Program specificity. Great. Thanks, Jason. Exposure and duration, adherence. Okay, I want to hear about that. More program specificity, quality of delivery, student engagement, adherence. So the MTSS question is a good one. So with the MTSS systems, and that's, you know, I'm sure part of the reason we're here today, you want to do that good systems work and to see what the MTSS implementation team is doing as a result of the systems coaching they're receiving and the training they're receiving. However, the way that the SPDIG is focused now, you have to capture fidelity of an intervention that reaches the child, right? So as much as you need to make sure those systems are in place, for the program measure, it has to be what's actually happening, if we're talking K through 12, in the classroom. If it's early intervention, it could be in the home setting, right? But what is actually reaching the child? That's what we're looking at for program measure 2 for fidelity now, is intervention fidelity. And some of you have heard me say this a lot of times. The reason that came about is we just weren't seeing the outcomes that you would expect from the SPDIGs. And what we learned over time was that you needed to capture what's happening at the system level, but also down on the ground as a SPDIG. And so that's why we switched over. We still think systems are important, but we're requiring that intervention that reaches the child level now for program measures. So thanks everyone for sharing that. And then the next question is about child outcome measures. So if you've been around for a little while, when you first heard the SPDIG was going to require a child outcome measure, how did you feel about it? And then now I'm wondering, how do you feel now about it? Is it a good thing? Do you think it's helping you in some way to tell your story? Do you feel like it should always have been a story that Congress heard about from our program measures? How do you feel about it?
I've always heard you talk about child outcome measures, and it has always been logical. I mean, we're only in this business to have something better for our students. So I'm all for it. Mhm.
Thanks, Matt. Okay. So I think, again, like some of you have heard me say this a million times, some of you have never heard me say it. So I'm just going to go ahead and say it again. Every year, Congress asks me for our outcomes. And think about who represents you in Congress. They generally are probably not going to know about intervention fidelity. It'd be unusual to find a member who knows that. That's not going to resound with them. What's going to resound is knowing what you all are doing for kids. And so I give them those outcomes. I've given those outcomes to them for years. And then I've always said, it'd be really helpful if all the projects were collecting this, but OMB wasn't Office of Management and Budget who makes final decisions about the GEPRA measures. They weren't on board yet. They're like, it's too far away. They can't do it. And we decided over time that there were enough examples of projects doing it that you can collect those outcome data. Not to say it's easy, but it can be done. And so that's the journey we're on right now. Grades lower than third grade. Jason, would you mind telling us a little bit about why lower than third grade is challenging?
Oh, sure. Can you hear me, Jennifer?
Yeah, you sound great.
Oh,
I did hear you. Now I lost you. All right. I think it's just an internet. You're having a little.
I might be back. I
Okay,
don't
you're
know
back.
if you can hear me. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's
Great
good.
timing, huh?
Ooh.
Yeah, I just think it's a little bit more difficult as people think about their own projects and also think about working with districts, or even if they're working only at the school level, trying to get the buy-in at the school level, to be able to acquire data across multiple locations that is in any way equivalent for students in grades second grade or lower. And of course, there is no state test at those grade levels, right? So you can't just rely on something that the State Department already has access to. Because again, even if they're doing something that's more of an interim assessment thing, and they do have it, at the district, the way you might go about acquiring it at the state level requires a certain amount of trust, especially, for those younger kids. And it's not always something that's a major feature in every district, or they certainly aren't using the same tools all the time at those grades.
Yeah, great. That's really helpful, Jason. Thank you. Anyone else want to share? I see some people are already doing it. So then it's just, and we haven't, it's very open to what you want to do with it. Purposely, because people, SPIGs are doing different things. And also we know OSEP and our contractor who looks at the GEPRA measures, SIP, we know we'll learn from you. And then there may need to be parameters in the future that we put on it. But currently we're just learning from what you give us. Yeah, and I think statewide assessments are an interesting conversation. They are available. You don't have to do a new data collection, but I think most of us have seen you can't rely on them, right? States change them and then you don't have trend data. Things happen like COVID and then you don't have any data at all. And they're not necessarily always as proximal as you want it to show the impact that you're having. So whatever the intervention is, it can be pretty far away from the intervention. So sometimes progress monitoring measures work a little better there. And Rebecca has her hand raised.
I was going to say what you just said, that I appreciate that you have left some flexibility in it so far as what student outcomes that we do measure, because then we're able to meet our grantees where they're at and support them in growing so that they can build their own sustainability so they can continue to do good work after we're gone. And so I just wanted to say I appreciate that you've left that. And I also wanted to chirp in about how state assessments aren't necessarily the most accurate either, because sometimes it's a measure of student buy-in as opposed to student skill. So I appreciate that you let us use local measures for student outcome.
Yeah. I remember when the state systemic improvement plan, the SIP, first came about out of our office, but the other division, monitoring and state improvement planning, and Kansas, and anyone here from Kansas, including Amy, want to tell me I'm wrong, but they asked if they could use progress monitoring measures, and it was a big discussion, right? But they eventually got it approved, which I was really excited about. I don't know if everyone at OSEP was excited about, but yeah, to me, it can be more meaningful because it's so much more connected to what you're trying to accomplish. Okay. Oh yes. So school level versus teacher level, the challenge if you're working with certain teachers in a building, that can be hard. Yep. That's a great point, Beth. Thank you.
And
thanks everyone for, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add, so on ours too, we do the MTSS systems implementation at district level, but another challenge is when you add that autonomy of where they can choose the innovation. So we have some choosing PBIS, some choose reading, and some choose math. And I'm just thinking of that when you go to report on that in the APR, it's a very small amount of text or a very short thing on that program measure. So sometimes it's hard to really elaborate on those different sites and different programs when it's a small amount of information. I know there's other areas we can share more text, but I think that when they're not only are they using different reading measures if they're doing reading, but then some are doing PBIS and some are, so it's just hard sometimes to tell that story when there's some autonomy.
Yeah, well said, Tammy. Thank you. Yeah, and I think the way that some folks have done it, and I totally see how this works, is about talking about growth, right? Like setting a target and or looking at growth over time. To me, that makes a lot of sense. And then you can talk about growth across, like 10% growth. And is it always going to be perfect? No. When I did my dissertation, I talked about fidelity, your decision point in fidelity, and of course I used 80%. Like, did a fidelity point really exist, like a decision point or target? No, I just made it up. But it was, you figure out what things are meaningful over time in terms of your targets. And I think fidelity is often along those lines, and progress can be, right, with all the different sites you're working on. Great. These are fantastic points. I'm really glad y'all are here. So let's get back. We just a heads up, we are going to have breakouts to talk about what Kristen shares with us. And so I just want to make you all aware of that. If you're not comfortable being on camera and that, just know that people are pretty okay being casual around here. And it's nice to get to know people, but we understand if you can't. So here's the theory of action. We've been talking about this already, really, but I want to add a few points. So the big idea, what you do is professional development, right? Or professional learning. At least 90% of your funds are spent on that. It can look different ways. You're meeting different needs in your states of children with disabilities, but the big idea is you're doing professional development, which we capture in program measure 1. It looks at your selection, your training, your coaching, your data systems, how administrators are part of it. So if you're doing all that well, then we think that educators, professionals, personnel, that they start using those skills that you're focused on. And then when they use those skills, we think that outcomes for children with disabilities will improve. Lots of assumptions there, but that's our theory of action. I'm not going to go into the other aspects today due to our limited time.
Jennifer, Anne Marie just asked in the chat if that graphic's on SIG Network, and I don't believe it is.
Oh, let's change that.
Yep, definitely.
Good idea, Anne Marie. All right, so here's the measure 4. It's real basic. Projects improve outcomes for children with disabilities. Again, super broad so that we can capture what everyone is doing. If you want the guidance document for program measure 4, I'll show you where it lives. If you go to SIG Network, And here's, I think I put that link in the chat, right? You go to SIG Network and you go to the top, see grants and APRs, choose APR and program measures. And then you go to program measures, and then program measure 4 is right here. And it's download, and then you just take it. So, and you're welcome to give feedback about how this looks, and what would be more helpful. But it talks about the purpose. Why are we doing this? And kind of some of the, the purpose of this FIDIG is to improve outcomes for children with disabilities. So we're just making sure we fulfill the purpose. Talks about the history of it, who has to respond to it, how it should look. And then it gives an example of Idaho's status chart. And this is from earlier in their project, Beth, right? Their evaluator is here. So this is from early in the project, when they first put their measures together. So 80% of Idaho's FIDIG schools will have 100% of students with disabilities reading on grade level, or will improve from fall to spring by 10% each year of the project. So there's that, like, you can have a target and an improvement target, or you could just do one or the other. Any questions about the guidance, where it's located, what it's all about? All right, so CIP, Center to Improve Project Performance, is the contractor that looks at our program measures, what we call the GEPR data. So each year they take APRs from projects that are in their second year of initiative implementation and further. On the second year, they're looking at just your professional development. And it sounds like someone's taking notes in the background, so just a heads up, you might want to mute if you're typing. So CIP looks at the different measures. They start in implementation year 2. They start looking at program measure 1, which is how you're doing professional development. And then in the next year, they start looking at implementation and how you're spending your money on the continuing, like the coaching, that kind of thing. At the end of your project, in year 5 of implementation, or however far you get to, depending on when you start, that's when they're actually going to report on your program measure 4. So it's what we call a long-term measure. And every program across the government has to have a long-term measure. So it's not just us. But these are their comments to date on what they've seen people give. It's not that they're reporting it, they're just looking at it, getting information. As I said, we're learning from you. So the target is a gap rather than a percentage of participants meeting the goal. The grantee should provide additional information. So they're not saying it's wrong. They're kind of trying to understand how that gap will be assessed. It might be a gap that you're closing between students with disabilities and students without. And then the other comment is, data from this grantee would be helpful to review to inform development of guidance on how to select among multiple outcomes. They had that to say 3 times. And I think what they were saying is, for those of you who are doing something like multi-tier system of support, where different interventions are being used, they just wanted to see a little more data, like how will you be collecting math data or social emotional learning data, whatever it happens to be within your MTSS. And let me know if you have questions. And John, if I'm not seeing something in the chat, let me know. So the challenge of having a proximal measure, I mentioned this before. A while ago, I had Wei Chow from IES join us. Does everyone know what IES is in the department? The research army, I'm seeing all nodding heads. So she has the portfolio of preparing teachers, providing professional development to teachers, and the interventions teachers use. Huge portfolio. She's very, very smart. And I had her come and speak on one of our directors' webinars a few years back. And I asked, what do you think, what's the biggest challenge you see with interventions and the impact that they have? And she said, people use outcome measures that are not proximal enough to the intervention, right? And so one example I used the other day is an intervention that's working on mentoring and having graduation as a measure. Graduation is a good measure. It's nice to see it's having impact, but it's a little distant from mentoring, right? It takes a little while to get there. a more proximal measure would be student attendance. So you might want both, but in terms of your program measure, you might want to use student attendance in that way. Same thing with statewide assessments, right? They're a little far away typically from what your intervention is. I mean, I would take arguments on that, but that's what I've seen so far. So any thoughts on proximal measures or questions about that?
That's a perfect analogy, Jennifer, and it really simplifies a quandary I've been having. The other quandary I'm having, and maybe somebody has figured out how to get around this, is I kept always thinking in the back of my mind, geez, if there was teeth, if there was a reason that, because Montana is a local control state. So as I was digging for data for the SPP APR, I went through comprehensive needs assessments. And I was like, woohoo, they're using the early warning system. Okay, now we're getting close. Okay. Because there's teeth. They have to do the CNA in order to be approved for their Title I funds. Total teeth, it's tied to budget. I'm like, yes, okay. But then when I found, so I went through to find, okay, what will help me see that we're actually tracking to graduation? So the early warning system.
Yes.
Well, come to find out, they're putting it in their CNA, but they're not actually using it.
Yep.
And I wasn't looking for data as a gotcha. I was like, well, there goes my thought that if there's actually teeth to something, that they will have fidelity and they will have follow through.
Yeah.
And I was completely wrong. So that, I love the proximal, which, look at attendance first, then see if it's tracking to graduation in my case. But then it's still, they're putting it in, they're getting approved, they're getting their Title I funds, but they're not clicking open the system 1 single second in inputting any data.
Yep. And that brings, of course, like a host of other discussions. And maybe that might even be our next discussion of thinking about all the contextual factors of how to get fidelity happening, right? Like in these problems of practice where seemingly the motivation is to make sure you don't get in trouble or you get your dollars or, whatever. That's the motivation. Like how do you bring in motivation to do the work so that you are making a difference for kiddos? Did I summarize it okay, Annette?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for raising that. That's fantastic. Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have, we're focused on MTSS also, and our districts choose, the area that's most needing for them, and then they, implement that through that framework. And one of the things that we've seen so far as, buy-in and doing these things is if it's purposeful for them, if it's meaningful for them in reaching their goals to help their kids, that matters much more than if it's a grant requirement. If it's a grant requirement, they don't put as much into it as if it's meaningful to them. And so, that's just what we see.
And
they'll still do it, but it's not as helpful.
Right. And to get to meaningful, you need on the ground conversations, right? Like you are unlikely to get that. I mean, maybe on a webinar, maybe it's hard. Maybe in a survey you could get it, but if you're able to see people face to face and have those conversations to figure out what's meaningful for them, it seems like it would be easier. And John, would you mind taking notes in the background just about, so I'm prepared for our next session, because I really like the motivation meaningful conversation for fidelity. And
Sure.
thank you so much. I appreciate it. I just can't do it, I think, and share my slides. Great. So I think, let me look and make sure if there's anything else. So I have one thing I want to share, and then I'm going to go ahead and give it to Kristen. I want to make sure she has enough time to share what they've been up to. There you go. So here's some examples. You can see I had shared the Idaho example before. And the reason I was comfortable sharing the Idaho example, and Beth, you may not know this because you're newer to it, we have it on the website. They approved us sharing it, but typically your APRs are not public information. So I have to ask you if I'm going to use, you know, anything that people would know who you are from it. So you can see what I just shared with you about their outcome measure. And just so you know, their fidelity measure is explicit instruction in the classroom using the reset rubric. And Beth, you can tell me if things have changed. I can't remember. And then the rates of, this is another one, the program measure or the outcome program measure for rates of average daily school attendance as a percentage of instructional days for American Indian students with disabilities in school districts implementing SPDIC supported activities to implement evidence-based practice for improving rates of graduation for American Indian students with disabilities, which happens to be Fidelity of Check and Connect mentor practices in this. And I would say they could, the reason that they're leaving it kind of open is because each of their districts gets to choose their intervention, but I happen to know they're all doing Check and Connect, and that's what they're doing. And then this one, just to throw you a little curveball, there are states that are just focused on either new teacher retention or getting teachers to licensure. And that's going to have a different outcome. Even though we call them child outcomes or student outcomes, that would have a different outcome. That's a conversation with your project officer and with me, and we can figure that out. But I did want to share that if it's just about teacher retention, just about getting licensure, not about specific interventions for them to use, then it's a different conversation. All right. So what is throwing you a curveball? And I want you to be thinking about that as I hand things over to Kristen Brown from Colorado. She also has Rebecca here. I don't know if anyone else from your team is here, but again, Kristen was kind enough at the last minute to share her problem of practice because I want to make sure that we had one for you all to think about, little food for thought. And so Kristen, there you are. Okay, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, well, that means that I'm going to jump all over. So hopefully,
I can ask you questions to help guide if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I don't have a PowerPoint, but
I can show what you sent me yesterday. Would that be okay?
well, I have a plan. So
Okay,
let
good.
me show you guys our measures. Share. So our measures for 4 are really looking at a school fidelity tool that we created. And we created the school fidelity tool off of practice profiles on our 5 components. So I'm going to show you the tool, but we're looking at school teams taking this tool, and I'll show you some data that I sent Jennifer yesterday. And then one of the components is family engagement. So we really wanted to pull that out. And then finally is linking it to their outcome goals. So what we did, and I'm just going to show you a snippet, it's super small, is we had all our districts. Tammy, I'm hearing what you're saying because I will tell you some of the challenges towards the end, but what we did is we walked them through a data protocol so they could identify what their goal statement was. So this is too small for you to read, but some are math, PBIS, literacy. So they're both academic and behavior. And so with that, it's easy to have one focus area, right? When you have all these different focus areas, it's a bit more challenging, but like Rebecca said, we think it's worth the challenge because it's reflecting their need. So I have these things open, all these places. So here's our school fidelity tool, and we're just in the process of.
Yeah, you're still showing the precise problem statement chart.
Oh, does it not move?
No, apparently not.
You might have chosen that as opposed to sharing your screen. I do that sometimes if you choose one document.
Oh, I did. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Now can you see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we created the school fidelity tool, and that's another challenging thing I would say to all of you, and you know this, when you're building the plane as you're flying it, and then you have due dates. So we're set now, but we're still building some other things out as well. But really the purpose of this was to work with school teams to look at, measure how they're using MTSS in their school, but around their focus area. So we always have the question, and those working with MTSS probably have this question too, is training and systems work for MTSS, and then also the focus area and balancing those two, and making sure that we're empowering them to really work in their focus area. And so I'll show you this. We tried to keep it small, so it's about 9 questions under each of the components. So one is team-driven shared leadership, database problem solving and decision making, family, school, and community partnerships, comprehensive screening and assessment, and then layered continuum of supports. And we have them measure that. So I will show you from a PowerPoint that we are giving to a board is we're pulling. So I will tell you with the school fidelity tool, we have a dashboard for our grantees. So it is great that they have access now to measure last year versus this year. So here are 2 schools. This one is in, it's by Alamosa. I'm going to show you Alamosa's. And let me put it on bigger. So this is the growth that they show between 2021 and, or 2022 and 2023. And they use this to guide their work. So for example, if this is low in team-driven shared leadership, then they put more effort in that, and you can see the results. Let me show you the next one. Here's Alamosa. So, and Rebecca, I'll let you chime in a minute, because let me get out of here for a minute. Because we're seeing growth. And it's really exciting. But Rebecca, do you want to say anything about your work and looking at the school fidelity tool?
I think what's great about the school fidelity tool is that it helps define the work for the school leadership teams. So they're able to see, the school implementation teams are able to see really what is this ambiguous, massive MTSS thing, you know? So it helps them in that way. And what's really been great is like Kristen said, we actually met our goal this year of growth on the school fidelity tool for our schools that started last year.
Thank you. So a couple of things that let me see if I wanted to share any of, we have a school fidelity checklist as well. And then I did want to tie in another measure to our work, with that we're using a look for tool to drill down to the classroom and the teacher. And so everything that we do is also linked to their focus area, which, like I said, is sometimes challenging. Some of the challenges that we've had are, this is a 5-year grant. So to train coordinators at the district level, to then bring in the school teams, to then get to the school, and we're in year 3 is challenging. We're doing it. We're getting pushback. We even got pushback from unions about the look for tool in the classroom. But we're doing it, and our goal is exactly what we're talking about, is to reach students and see an impact of PD plans and action planning, and that systems work, that teamwork around RTI and an MTSS system. But the challenges are turnover. We've had one district that coordinator, superintendent, all the champions left. So there's always that. And then they want to change their focus area. And that's one of our outcomes. And then that time piece over 5 years.
Yeah, so just in case this is helpful, as an outsider, so the look for tool is the intervention fidelity tool.
Yeah.
Which connects with that systems tool or systems fidelity assessment. And so the look for tool, they're making it specific to the different interventions being used. And then they're going to look at the child outcomes specific to that intervention. and they're gonna look at, and remind me, Kristen, you all are thinking about, I know you had it on your program measures page, you're thinking about growth for the student outcome?
Yes. So, again, it's challenging with the time frame. So honestly, I can tell you, and this won't come as a shock to any of you, that people are in different places with their focus areas and completing their PD plans and their action plans. So there are some times where we're measuring a focus area where they haven't had their PD yet. So our goal, I think how we would define success is having that PD plan, the action plan, and actually getting to the teachers and affecting the students. And that's what we're hoping that we'll see with the Look For tool. So the school fidelity tool is great. It's looking at the 5 components, but it's really in combination with the Look For tool that we're really seeing is it getting to teachers, not just the school level team, but is it getting to teachers and is it affecting students? So on the Look For tool, we do have 1 student engagement question, and then the other 4 are around the focus area.
Yeah, so that there's a similar, although the Look For tools are, and you guys, Rebecca and Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but although the Look For tools are specific to the intervention, the program that they're using, there is one shared element across all of those, which is student engagement.
Yep. Let me show you.
Kristen, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yep. So the student engagement one is engaging students in meaningful interactions with content. And I won't necessarily read you the whole thing, except to say that we worked with Karen Ward on this from NERN. And I want to give her credit because that's one of her Otis questions. But yes, it was important that we had that student engagement question in there.
And Otis, just so people know, because there's Otis in Oklahoma, which is their multi-juice support. This is Otis, instructional strategies tool. So it's taking the instructional strategies that Hattie found to be the most effective and then measuring, and observation to see what teachers are using of those strategies and collecting them.
Rebecca, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, so with this Look For tool, it's basically a classroom fidelity tool, and we taught our teams how to identify if we're training our staff to implement this program intervention, whatever it is that they're implementing, what are we going to see the teachers doing and saying when we walk into the classroom? And it was a huge moment for a lot of teams to be thinking that way, because they're so focused on what are students doing when we walk in, as opposed to how are we equipping teachers to help students meet, their goals. And so anyway, that was another very cool part of this process, was training the teams and seeing the light bulbs go on, oh, that will make training more effective if we're actually looking at if teachers are doing it. And then how can we provide additional supports if they're struggling with some of these areas? So
yeah. And it was, I'm so glad you said that, Rebecca, because it is, I think you're right on, is that often people are using tools, carrying things out, and they don't really even know why. It's like, okay, this is required to get our money from the grant, kind of like to Annette's point earlier, or not even doing that instance, but really getting at, like, it's getting at that theory of action or the rationale or the why, like Simon Sinek, like why we're doing this, because we think it's going to make a difference. And that's part of the motivation that you had brought up earlier, is that they've got it in Gusky, going way back. Gusky, when evaluating professional development, found that you don't necessarily need the buy-in when you first start. You can get the buy-in once people see impact. And so helping people to see the impact, to understand what the theory of action, the rationale, the why they're doing certain things, and then connecting that to the student outcomes is going to help them continue to implement more fully and to sustain.
And that is one of our slides that we use when we are recruiting new districts, is to show the data of increase in focus areas. So because of the systems work and investing in that, you're going to see an increase in math, if that's your focus area, because data, data shows what the impact is.
Yep. Great. What questions do you all have for Colorado's team of two? Here. So I don't want to lose a bunch of people by going into breakouts. So maybe folks could vote with their reactions, how we feel about breakouts. Because what we could do, if John is able to do this, and if Rebecca and Kristen don't mind, we could have two groups. Kristen could be in one, or Rebecca could be in one, and you could have some more conversations about it. So
That
why don't
works.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for being willing. Rebecca, would that be okay with you? So why don't we do this? If folks are okay, thank you, Beth Ficklin. If folks are okay with being in a breakout, when you get placed in the room by John Lind, just go ahead and go in. If you don't want to be in the breakout, just don't choose to go in. You can stay in the main room and we can come back and folks will share after 10 minutes, just a few highlights. Each room will need a reporter just to share a couple of highlights from the conversation with the group. So we'll have 10 minutes. One reporter. If you don't want to go, just stay in the main room and you can wait for the report out or ask me questions as well. And then John, is that okay? We're going to put Rebecca in one and Kristen in the other.
Yep, give me just a minute. I'm working on it now.
Sure. Anyone questions about the breakout? So I'll type the directions. 10 minutes, choose one reporter. We'll come back for a few minutes and hear a few highlights from the group. And you can go any direction you want with the conversation, but I just think it's helpful to have Rebecca and Kristen there to answer questions if you had follow-ups. Any questions for me? All right, well, Kristen and Rebecca, we'll see you in a minute, but thank you very much. That was very helpful. And you did it quickly, which I'm always impressed by.
All right, I think I've got it organized. So I'll start the rooms and we'll come back in 10 minutes.
All right, we got one group. Now I got two groups. Great, good to see you guys. All right, reporters are going to get to share one thing. I'm sorry, but it just came down to this timing wise. So who was a reporter in your group?
We failed to assign one. Does anybody want to volunteer?
One thing. Welcome back, everybody. We're just sharing, each reporter is just going to share one thing because we have 2 minutes. So anyone from a group want to report a big idea that was especially resonated with them?
I failed as a facilitator because we did not assign a reporter.
That's
Well, I will say that Kristen was extremely helpful in thinking a little bit more through what it looks like in schools, and that ability to have flexibility, local context, while keeping that high quality and the support aspects that help you see those changes.
awesome. Yeah, and it's interesting being the project officer for Colorado. I've seen how challenging it is. It's like, it's always nice when you come to these groups and you're like, oh, great, you created a measure. That's part of, you know, your people actually help them carry it out. No, that sounds great. But it's like, I've seen how much on the ground work this is taking, especially, you know, and she added the unions. Jason added, we talked a lot about the mechanics as well, all the way from training and calibration to calculation at the local level and reporting back to the projects, right? So many elements. All right, we are at the top of the hour. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Colorado team pair, whatever you're going to call it. You are fantastic. Thank you for caring so much about your work too. It was great to hear from you all. So thanks to Annette and Rebecca and anyone else who is thinking this way. Next time, we're going to talk about motivation and fidelity and how those two connect. So got a topic. We'll send out a date. It was great to see you all. Enjoy what for most of us, I think, is a long weekend. Rebecca, did you have, oh, you got to clap. Okay. I have terrible vision. All right. Thank you, John.
Thank you.